We're going to touch on pain in this video, and we'll start with a brief overview of what pain is, how it works, the brief neurology of it. We'll talk a bit about acute pain, and then we'll focus primarily on chronic pain and the cycles of chronic pain that we might experience when something has transferred from acute to chronic. So to begin with, what is pain? Pain is a sensory experience that is typically designed to give us a warning that something not so great is happening. We can experience pain as a warning or when there is actually an injury or tissue damage. If I reach out and I touch something hot, the receptors in my hand, if that's what I'm using to touch the hot surface, there might be some dull pain, some sharp pain, some heat receptors that are going to pick up on the message that I'm touching something that is potentially a tissue threat. They're going to send an action potential and a response all the way up to my spinal cord and my brain. My brain is going to process this message that it's getting and decide what it wants to do about it. In this case, very likely, it's going to say, withdraw your hand, take your hand away from that hot stimulus because you are at risk of burning your skin. And as long as I haven't, created any tissue damage, typically that pain response will go away. That sensation that I'm experiencing will go away as soon as I remove my hand from the stimulus, and all is well and good. Everything comes back to baseline. Totally normal. That pain sensation can also be a little more complex than just an actual sensory experience. Oftentimes it can come with an emotional process with it. We can feel some fear, any other emotional input that happens, and that can have a side effect of activating our sympathetic nervous system. We might end up in fight, flight, or freeze, and that's kind of the complexity of pain. However, the actual sensory experience of pain is very much stimulating a nerve ending here. It sends a message all the way up to the brain. The brain processes that information and then does something about it. Now, what happens is if I don't remove my hand in time and I end up with an actual burn or an injury or tissue damage to my hand, I can experience something that's called acute pain. And acute pain is something that I'm experiencing in the moment, as well as while any actual tissue damage is healing. So, if I end up with that burn on my hand, that is probably going to hurt for a while, and it's going to hurt until that tissue is totally healed, because it's going to be more sensitive. There's going to be inflammation here. There's going to be, more complex stuff happening at the actual location of injury. And so it's going to be giving me much higher warning signals. Now, I might touch something that is like not any particular temperature. It's totally neutral, and I touch it and I might get a warning bell or a pain signal go off because I am at risk of further tissue damage. So during that healing phase, that is a phase where we're going to continue to experience that acute pain that we might feel while the actual stimulus is present. And traditionally, as we've learned about the body and healing, what should happen is that once that tissue is healed, everything should come back down to baseline, no more acute pain, things settle out, everything goes back to factory settings. When we transition into chronic pain, the, kind of more simplistic definition of chronic pain is pain that persists beyond 3 to 6 months, is what they say, or beyond any lasting tissue damage. Once the tissue is healed, pain should theoretically go away. So if pain is persisting beyond tissue healing, then that is what we would consider chronic pain. So chronic pain becomes a lot more complex than the simplicity of an acute pain stimulus when we have tissue damage or an actual input of threat going in. We feel acute pain. When those things are gone, pain goes away. That's not the case in chronic pain. Chronic pain is something that we experience when our nervous system hasn't quite got the update that the threat is gone. And as we know, one of the jobs of the nervous system is to keep us safe. The nervous system is constantly sampling our environment and, constantly in communication with the world around us to be assessing for threat. It's constantly looking for things that could be causing us danger, and it is constantly trying to mitigate that and keeping us safe. So when the nervous system has experienced something that it is determined to be dangerous or a threat or, possibly contributing to tissue damage, it will do everything it can to keep us from experiencing that danger again. And so as a result, it will learn new behavior patterns, and it'll learn, even different movement patterns, or will behave differently so as to completely avoid having that experience again, to protect us and protect our nervous system, protect our tissue, protect our body, and so on and so forth. This change in behavior pattern is part of what can contribute to the sensitization of the nervous system. And so an analogy that I'll give you is that of a car alarm. And if we have, so we buy a brand new car. Let's say I get the newest, latest, greatest Tesla. If someone, tries to break into my Tesla, the alarm bells are going to go off. Someone smashes the windows, it's going to honk. It's going to make all sorts of weird and wonderful noises, and it's going to alert someone that alarm is going off, that something bad has happened. Someone has damaged it. Someone's broken in. The alarm bells go off. And that's what we would hope for, right? We pay a lot of money for these things. So if there is a sensitization process, what happens is it's almost like the dial, the threshold for that alarm going off gets totally cranked up. And now what might happen is that alarm might go off to rain touching the Tesla. It might not be that it needs someone smashing the window. It could very well be that it's just wind has brushed by it, or yes, rain is falling on it. And now all of a sudden these alarm bells are going off to something that's actually not going to damage it. If rain or wind is going to damage my Tesla, I'm not going to buy one. So the same thing happens in the body. Now, if I touch something really, really hot that potentially damages my skin, what might happen is now if I touch something, tissue's totally healed. If I touch something that, just feels slightly warm, that same alarm bell might go off and give me that warning in my brain, when in fact it's totally harmless to touch said object, the more lukewarm one. There's a really great TED Talk by a very famous pain scientist in Australia, Dr. Lorimer Moseley, and he talks about an experience that he had. And he was hiking in the bush in Australia, and while he was walking, he felt something, hurt his skin on his leg, and he didn't really think much of it. He's like, oh, that was kind of uncomfortable. And then next thing you know, he looks down and he's been bitten by a snake, and it ends up being this very poisonous snake, and it's all hell breaks loose and things go a little crazy, and lo and behold, he survives. It's totally fine. Fast forward X amount of time in the future, he's hiking again in the bush, and all of a sudden he feels this intense pain in his leg. And he looks down because he's had a very scary previous experience with something similar. He looks down and he's just got a scratch on his leg. It's just a branch that's given him a little scratch. And yet his nervous system gave him this pain response that was far beyond the original pain response he had when he was actually bitten by a snake, and it was really, really dangerous. But what this tells us is that our nervous system learns very quickly, and it has this incredible ability to create, I guess you could call it like a mountain out of a molehill. So based on previous experience, if we've had a very, very dangerous previous experience, now anything, minutely, a fraction similar to that previous experience is going to be experienced on a much higher pain scale. So those are a couple examples of how the nervous system becomes sensitized, and how chronic pain can become this issue when tissue has actually healed and this pain signal is persisting. So how does that happen? I've mentioned sensitization. Central sensitization is the word that you may have heard, and central sensitization is essentially when the synapses, the junctions between nerves, increase their communication. So there's more neurotransmitter being put across, and the dendrite on the other end is sending off its signals to the brain much more readily. So we call that central sensitization, postsynaptic sensitization. It's a lengthy word. It's a little complex, but all you need to know is that these signals are getting sent to the brain much more regularly. The threshold for sending that message is a lot lower, so it takes a lot less input for that to be sent up to the brain. In addition to that, what we know is that the receptors, so the nerve endings that detect, touch and pain and heat, etc., they also decrease their threshold for sending a stimulus to the brain. So if a receptor has had a previous injury, if I've had a burn here, now that heat receptor and that pain receptor is going to detect threat much more easily than it would have previously. Meaning it might detect things that are not threatening at all as being potentially threatening, and we're going to have this pain response in the body that might not be appropriate. Another aspect of the sensitization is the increase in the emotional aspect to it as well. So what can happen is when we experience pain, we often have an association of increase in fear. We have an increase in, if things are chronic, often frustration and resentment and anger and even sadness and grief. These things all get linked into that process. And when we experience pain, we experience fear. And then what happens is, even if we're not experiencing pain locally at a receptor, we have more fear. What happens when we have fear and anger about a certain experience is that tends to turn on our autonomic nervous system signals, and we end up in a more sympathetic state. When we're in a more sympathetic state, our fight or flight systems are going off. We are far more concerned with survival in the short term, and then what happens is we decrease our pain threshold, and then we end up with these more sensitized systems in the body, and it just creates this positive feedback loop where more pain, more fear, more frustration sensitizes everything and makes us more receptive to pain and to that experience of chronic pain. And so it's just this cycle and this feedback loop that continues to happen when we're experiencing chronic pain, and it becomes more and more and more frustrating. We get more and more fearful of certain movements because they hurt more and more and more, and it's a really difficult cycle to break. So what we need to know here, though, is that this is a cycle we can break. It is possible. It absolutely is possible. And the thing that I want to mention is that a lot of the times when being taught this cycle, a lot of practitioners and a lot of the people in the medical community will often tell clients or tell people that the pain is in their head without explaining what actually happens. And that can create this complete cycle of invalidation, increase frustration, and actually create what we call a nocebo effect. So it is really important, for breaking the cycle, to educate ourselves, and us as practitioners to provide good education for our clients about what this cycle is and how sensitization happens. So education is the biggest piece of breaking the chronic pain cycle, because the pain is actually being interpreted in our head and our brain, but there are actual biological changes happening in the nervous system that are increasing our experience of pain in our head. So yes, our experience of pain is in the head, and it is being, interpreted here, but it is as a result of an increased sensitization of the rest of the nervous system. So really, really important to know that there. At the end of the day, pain is our body's way of keeping us safe. And so being in communication with it is really, really important, and appreciating that our nervous system and these pain experiences are trying to keep us safe. So understanding that is really helpful, because we can hear the pain, and then we can decide how we want to respond to it. So taking a moment when we do experience pain to then, perhaps have a conversation with it, or have a conversation with ourselves, and try to figure out if the pain is as a result of a true threat or not. And so that is a big step in the healing process, is just for a moment being able to question, is what I'm feeling appropriate? Because sometimes our nervous system, as we talked about, becomes sensitized, and it starts to be a little over the top with the messages that it's sending us. And so being able to step back for a moment and be like, hey, is this actually, an appropriate amount of pain? Tough to say. good healthcare practitioners can really help you with that process, because it is really important to actually have structural and tissue sources of pain sorted out. We want to make sure there's nothing red flaggy happening. We want to make sure that there are no, changes in tissue, no inflammatory processes or injuries to the tissue, or, other more health concern aspects of this, So having a good physical workup is really, really important to actually rule out physical sources of pain. That is the first thing you want to do. Once that's been ruled out, then we can move into this more behavioral change aspect of it. And so, like we said, education is a huge, huge piece of this. So understanding the way pain works in the body is a huge aspect of healing. Then we can start to include some more cognitive therapies. So, starting to rewrite the narrative and the experience of the behavioral changes that we've had as a result of pain. So that's where that communication comes in. That's where, having the questions where you're saying, is this true that I'm, in danger, and being in communication with our pain, and then starting to rewrite the narratives and stories that we have perhaps started to tell ourselves as a result of our experience. That's a big part of it. And, a good therapist can help us through that. There's many other modalities. There's CBT and EMDR, cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization, reprogramming. These things can be really, really helpful for helping us reprogram that narrative and story that we've started to tell ourselves as a result of the pain. Doing some body-based modalities are also going to be really helpful. So manual therapy, getting some soft tissue work done, some joint mobilizations. Exercise is huge. Exercise helps us to begin to foster trust in our body again, and helps us to experience positive movements without pain, or even with pain. It teaches us that, oh, hey, actually things didn't get worse, or I didn't damage tissue by moving. Exercise through this process is really, really big for fostering trust with the body and the nervous system. Along with that, just all the other stress management tools that we've been exposed to, all the, eating well, sleeping well, meditating, exercise, time in nature, all these things, rest, super important for just general nervous system health. So all of these in combination can be really, really powerful tools for managing chronic pain and learning to break the cycle of chronic pain. Chronic pain is no joke. It's no fun. And, it takes a really good, trustworthy relationship with a health practitioner to make that happen. So the big things that are important to look for in a healthcare practitioner is someone who's committed to education, someone who validates your experience. And the other piece I want to touch on here is making sure that you feel safe with them, and that the language they're using isn't making you more fearful. It's not wrong to be telling, clients truth about what is happening about pain. And, if there are concerns that we need to think about in the body, that is also really important to consider. However, the language the practitioner uses has to make you feel safe. And if it makes you feel worse and you continue on the chronic pain cycle, it's probably not the person you want to be working with. I will be filming, a little bit more around the nocebo effect and the importance of language in healthcare, but that's a really good introduction to it there. So just making sure that the language they're using isn't scaring you more. That's a really, really important piece to breaking the chronic pain cycle. I know that was a lot to take in, so I appreciate you sticking it out. If you have any questions, add them below in the comments. And in the meantime, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear back from you. Be sure to like and subscribe as always, because that's how we get this information out to more people. Thanks a lot for listening.